So my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the founder and CEO of the 311 Institute, the World Futures Forum, and Exponential University. The 311 Institute is a futures and deep futures think tank working with the world's most respected brands, as well as all G20 governments, as well as royalty, to help them see, envision, build, and lead the future and deep future, where we see the deep future as being up to 50 years out. Now, when we have a look at the World Futures Forum, the World Futures Forum increasingly works with organizations like the United Nations to bring people together to help us solve some of the world's greatest challenges, such as climate change, famine, hunger, poverty, education, inequality, and so on and so forth. And then the Exponential University is one of the world's first virtual reality universities that's designed to make futures education accessible to everybody, irrespective of their location, their ability, or their background, so that everyone can actually profit from the visions of the future that we're actually laying today. So when we have a look at growing inequality throughout the world, basically and making sure that the benefits of the future are actually equally distributed to everybody on the planet, not just the people who have the money and the resources to afford them or use them or access them, it's an increasingly complex subject. So for example, if we have a look at increasing inequality in the world, what we have is we have technologies, we have an increasingly connected and digital society that lets individuals now create new products and services that can change the lives of billions of people and be sold to billions of people at a rate that would have been unimaginable even just 20 years ago. Now, on the one hand, this means that, for example, some of the billionaires that we see today will inevitably become the world's first trillionaires, because if you have a single individual, say, for example, the likes of Jeff Bezos, whose original market might have been the United States, but whose modern market is now everyone who's connected. You know, we have 3.5 billion people who are connected on the planet today. In the next 10 years, that's going to be 7.5 to 8 billion people, including children, obviously. And so what you see is this wealth gap that we see today is only going to actually accelerate and increase. Now, when we start having a look at how we solve some of these inequality issues, this is where I often talk about the concept of ethical capitalism. So this is where everybody wins. So organizations should no longer be driven purely by profit. They should be driven by purpose, and they should be trying to extend the benefits of their own businesses to local communities. They should be looking at how they can improve the earth. We talk about sustainability. Now, if we have a look at sustainability, for example, today, if we stopped pumping carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere, we still have a relatively ravaged world. So when we look at sustainability issues within the corporate environment, are we talking about sustainability, or are we talking about regenerative practices, which is an entirely different kind of conversation to have? Now, similarly, when we actually have a look at the future of business, everything is accelerating. Everything is becoming increasingly disruptive. And from a government perspective, we can talk about policies such as the redistribution of wealth, the increased taxation of billionaires, as we're already seeing basically with the US government, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, as long as we have a capitalist system that treats people as commodities, that treats the earth basically as a resource to be raped and pillaged, we are still going to be in the situation that we are today, where we have lots and lots of problems that are solvable, but that we're not solving. And so this, certainly in my mind, requires corporations to reset their thinking. Solving a lot of the world's challenges isn't actually as difficult as you might think, but it does take a reset and a rethink and a reinvention, basically, of your own business, your organization's operating model, perhaps, the way that you scale your businesses, the way that you engage not just shareholders, but also stakeholders. And interestingly enough, basically, when we actually talk about shareholders, in 2019, Jamie Dimon, who heads up the New York City Business Council, met with the CEOs of 250 of the Fortune 250. And 168 of those CEOs, including the likes of Jeff Bezos and others, actually decided to scrap their focus, their primary focus, on what we call the shareholder primacy rule. Now, what the shareholder primacy rule basically was a policy that was put in place in the 1990s that put the needs and the requirements of shareholders first. So that's profit above people and planet and purpose. Now, by no longer making this policy the Fortune 250's North Star, suddenly the New York Business Council and over 160 CEOs in the Fortune 250 are now looking more at the long term. Because if you have a look at the long term, Amazon is famous for looking at the long term. They have 7-year plans. They originally went to Wall Street and said, don't expect us to make any profit. But when we do start making profit, we'll make you rich. So a lot of business leaders today understand the business of long-term thinking and planning over short-termism. And shareholders are starting to get this idea as well. I work with a lot of the world's largest investment organizations, and it's very encouraging to actually see organizations across every sector, of every color and creed, starting to turn the corner now to actually take more of a sustainable and ethical role, basically in helping solve some of the world's challenges that we have, while still actually making even more profit and increasing revenues in new ways than they would have thought of possible before. So the first thing to do when we start talking about being prepared for the future is you need to open your mind to explore new things and be receptive to new things. Secondly, you often need to change the culture of your organization. So I'm going to give you some examples. Now, when we have a look at science fiction, every single thing that you think of as science fiction is already science fact. I can show it to you. I can take you to the university laboratories that are actually building these things and demonstrating these things. I'm going to give you some examples, but we're going to then bring that back to a business footing. So, for example, we already have brain-machine interfaces that are able to read your mind and stream your thoughts and images straight to YouTube, albeit quite fuzzy. Secondly, we actually have tractor beams courtesy of the New York University as well as Bristol University in the UK. And these are actually tractor beams which actually have an impact on how we assemble products that are 3D printed, for example. When we have a look at holograms, basically we have BNYU who've actually developed Princess Leia holograms that use femto lasers to create genuine holograms. We're not talking about volumetric displays here that are encapsulated in glass or where we use augmented reality or we use the sort of Pepper Ghost analogy. These are genuine holograms like the ones that we actually see in Blade Runner 2069. So we even have artificial intelligences today, courtesy of Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, Baidu, that are evolving themselves and evolving their own code, designing themselves, creating and spawning child AIs. We have robots that are able to evolve their own code, that are able to evolve their own design and then 4D print themselves off on a printer and walk off the printer. So when we start talking about the realm of science fiction, whether it's being able to turn humans using synthetic biology into the equivalent of biological supercomputers, we have those technologies today. And as I say, I can show you them. Now, bringing this back to a business footing, when we start having a look at the development of artificial intelligence, for example, we move from deep learning, we then move to explainable artificial intelligence. But what starts happening when the artificial intelligence within your organization's technology stack starts evolving? And if you think that's kind of a weird thing to be asking, that's exactly what happened to Facebook. They had 2 AIs basically that were there to do price matching and price comparisons and then set the right prices on e-commerce sites. And those artificial intelligences ultimately learned how to collaborate with one another and price fix. Now that gives the regulators a problem. So this is just scratching the surface of what's a very, very big issue. But when we start having a look at the new disruptive technologies that are coming along the line that can actually disrupt you, your organization, your business, your industry, global culture and society, there are thousands of examples like these that have an impact basically on you today, how you develop your strategies and vision, and how you build out your technology stacks. So the reference basically to being a young Kurzweil was actually when I was giving a keynote presentation to a number of financiers in London, up at the RCA Club a little while ago. And the person that actually gave me that moniker was actually Ray Kurzweil's investment banker. That's it, which I thought was a great honor. So that's a sort of little story. That's where that one sort of come from. But in terms of trying to predict the future accurately, what we are really able to do is we can show different versions and visions of the future. Now, the closer that we are to today, the more accurate we can be with our predictions. So, for example, if I went out to the average Joe on the street and said, what do you think the future of transportation or cars is going to be? Inevitably, they're going to say, well, I think cars are going to be electric and I think they're going to drive themselves. Now, they aren't futurists, but what they do is they have access to enough data points to be able to relatively accurately predict that the future of cars is electric. And the way that they can do this is because they can see more electric cars on the streets. They can see the manufacturers developing more electric cars. They can see perhaps bankers and the investment community investing more in electric constructs. In addition to that, they can see the regulators approving electric cars for use on our streets. Their friends have bought one. They can see prices falling, all these kinds of different things. So people that say that we can't predict the future, I typically think are actually wrong, but there are always caveats. Now, when we start having a look at being able to predict the longer term future, the further out you go, the broader you go, absolutely the fuzzier it gets. So for example, when we have a look at the future of computing, we've got quantum computers coming through now, but really they'll be commercially viable and ready in 2025-ish. However, right on the back of quantum computers, we have neuromorphic computers. We have biological computers where we have turned E. coli bacteria and even humans, as well as other organisms, into computing devices that let us store information, perform complex calculations in DNA, for example, and then retrieve information. So when we start having a look at these deeper futures, and I help a lot of organizations with deeper futures because they want to become, for example, centennial organizations, companies like Decathlon, companies like Samsung, Arm, Disney, all these others. Invariably, when we look at the deeper futures, really it is about the realm of the future possible. So in answer to your sort of question, just to summarize, I look at a staggering number of data points to try to determine what's the problem that we are trying to solve today. That's an innovation problem. What new technologies can we use to combine together to solve those problems? And are they then, from an execution perspective, going to be accessible, affordable? What does the liability look like? Are the regulators going to approve them? Culturally, do we actually accept these new products, and so on and so forth? So it's what's the problem? How do we solve the problem? And then when does the new product or service that we've created get into the market and actually disrupt the status quo? And to do all of this, to see these with any level of accuracy, and I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, requires a huge amount of data from thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different sources. And that's what I do. So one of my skills as a futurist and strategic advisor to businesses is the ability to take a huge amount of geek speak and translate it into English. So for example, when we have a look at the metaverse, ultimately the metaverse's end game is to combine the digital, physical, and virtual worlds together in such a way that makes those virtual worlds that we can then experience and explore and do different things in almost indistinguishable from reality itself. Today, from a metaverse perspective, we're kind of metaverse 1, which is relatively basic. We talk about being able to play into people's 3 senses, predominantly touch with haptics, vision, and sound. But in the future, we can tap into all 5 senses. We can also bring in motion with things like virtual reality boots, which are actually a thing. But we can also see the development today of certain neural interfaces that, in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, they want to be able to beam the metaverse straight into your head. That sounds like science fiction. It's not as science fiction as you might think. Now, when we have a look at Web3, Web3 is an extension of Web2. So we are still very much a Web2 economy, but Web3 involves tokenization. And it's really the decentralization of everything that we think of the internet. The internet today isn't actually decentralized. It's managed by a lot of centralized systems like DNS, for example, and the ICANN networks and so on and so forth. So Web3 is just really the modern day internet, but much, much more distributed from an architectural perspective. And obviously there'll be new experiences and everything else that we can build on top of that. When we start having a look at the futures that are really going to be foundational over the next 50 years, there are 24 primary technologies. We call them general purpose technologies. So a general purpose technology is a technology that you can innovate on top of almost in an unlimited way. So technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, 3D printing, 5G, virtual reality, augmented reality, genetic engineering and editing, those sorts of things. That, for example, when we look at gene editing, a lot of people don't think that that's a GPT, but you can actually create the future of energy using genetic engineering because you can genetically engineer new biofuels, for example, just a quick example there. So when we actually have a look at the future of global culture, industry, and society, it is all going to be shaped by really a handful of general purpose technologies, quantum computing, these sorts of things. And it's not a single technology that shapes our future societies. It's how we combine all of these different technologies together to create next generation products or services or capabilities. Whether, for example, it's the use of the sensors in your smartphone or the camera in your smartphone combined with artificial intelligence and a 5G network that all of a sudden means that I have a tricorder in my hand that I can then sell and promote to 250 people in Africa who don't necessarily have access to quality primary or secondary healthcare. So there's a whole load of different things that we can unpack when we're starting to have conversations about, what does the future look like? How does it solve some of the problems that we see today? What new problems does it actually create? And again, that's where I come in. Under normal circumstances and in more normal times, one of the things that increasingly gets me is that a lot of people are actually either apprehensive and or fearful about the future. It varies a little bit by continent and by country, but generally the vast majority of people that I meet are actually worried about the future and their own livelihoods and everything else. Now, part of the reason for that, in fact, there are a number of reasons for that, is firstly, when we have a look at our news networks, for example, CNN, the Crisis News Network, we are always being told that artificial intelligence is going to take our jobs. It's going to automate 50% of all of the jobs that we have today. And frankly, you're all going to be kicked to the curb. And maybe we have to explore something like a universal basic income construct in order to help people just buy bread in the morning. But that's not necessarily the case. So for example, if we have a look at AI, we move into what we call the centaur phase. This is where by tag teaming humans basically with increasingly powerful artificial intelligences, you can learn how to do new things, develop new strategies in new ways. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. So this is where we really start talking about using artificial intelligence to augment the human worker. Now, in addition to that, when we have a look at some of the other sort of system level disruptions that we see, we already see the world's militaries building semi and fully autonomous robotic systems, hunter-killer systems. The United Nations recently called one out. It was a Turkish drone that actually went offline. So in other words, it lost its connection. And allegedly, as far as the United Nations were able to determine, it was able to go off and kill insurgents in Libya by itself. Now, we already have the technologies for fully autonomous war. And we also have a lot of countries who aren't signing up to not automate and create fully autonomous war machines. So that concerns a lot of people, and we see that in the coming through in the news as well today. But in addition to that, when we have a look at an increasingly polarized society, we have a look at runaway climate change and all these other things. People increasingly are exposed to bad news. Our news networks basically play to our fright and flight response. But there is a huge amount of good news, basically, that we can actually convey. For every single bad news story, I can show you 100 good news stories of how we actually, as individuals, have the power and the potential to change the world for good. For example, let's solve global famine right here. The United Nations typically thinks that if you want to solve global famine, you need more farms, you need more agricultural capacity, we need more livestock, we need more crops to feed the livestock, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is we're running out of land. So we then talk about genetic engineered crops and everything else. When we talk about solving global famine, we have two primary technologies that we can bring into bear. So we can take a cell from a chicken feather and we can turn that into chicken nuggets in something called a bioreactor. This is a clean meat trend. KFC are already starting to sell clean meat chicken nuggets. When we have a look at agriculture, we can grow 8 times the yields in vertical farms, which is why Jeff Bezos has actually invested $250 million in a variety of different vertical farm companies. We have the technology and the capability and the ingenuity and the creativity today to solve some of the world's greatest challenges. But where are those news stories? They don't sell papers, so you don't see them. And that's one of the things that I try to surface. I try to surface and amplify the positive things that we are doing as a society, the positive voices that we see coming through, and then demonstrate clearly in plain English how we can take these new innovations, these new constructs, these new technologies to help improve people's lives everywhere for the better. And as you can tell, from an ethics perspective, the regulators are typically way behind the curve. I speak to a lot of regulators and they always say to me, we are policy wonks and lawmakers. We don't really understand technology. If we have a look at the creation of fully autonomous electric grids, what's the risk associated with that? Regulators have a problem getting their heads around that. The way that we solve the regulator problem, we're doing this across the Middle East, we're doing this across Europe, is you bring the regulators into the conversations early on so they can see what you are making and they can say, if you make an autonomous energy grid in this way, we're not going to approve it. But if you do it this way, we will. By involving regulators early on in the product development cycles in innovation accelerators and incubators and all these kinds of other things, corporate venture capital, meetings and sessions and committees and everything else, we can typically take anywhere between a couple of years to, in the FDA's case, 6 years off the approval of new healthcare treatments and medicines and everything else. We have solutions. You just need to hear about them. So what organizations get by engaging me, basically, is they get a complete view of the future. That is something that they cannot get anywhere else. Now, when we have a look at the future, I cross every sector, every technology. I cross a huge variety of different innovations from today to 50 years out. And from an organizational perspective, we care about the future because the more we can understand about the future, the better informed we are when it comes to creating business strategy, business vision. And that's important because that affects who we hire. That affects how we train people. It affects the products that we develop. It affects our investment decisions and all manner of other things. But again, really sort of bringing it back to something that's a little bit maybe more straightforward. When we look at the future, we care about 3 things. What does the future look like? And what the future looks like invariably depends on the problems that we are trying to solve. That's an innovation question. What are the problems today that are worth solving that can earn us money in the future? Secondly, what technologies can we combine together to create next generation products and services that will help us serve these new demographics, these new consumers, or these new markets? And then thirdly, maybe most importantly in most people's eyes, the when. When will these new products and services that either we or our competitors have created affect the markets that we care about? So that's either as a disruptive threat or as a disruptive opportunity. And what I'm able to do is I'm able to take the huge volumes of change that are affecting every single industry, every single stakeholder and shareholder that you care about, and condense that down to a session that by the end of the session, as I often say to audiences, the only thing that I've done is change your perception of everything. And once we've opened people's minds, we've opened people's thinking, we've actually exposed them to what's going on in the environments around them, your business will never be the same again, but in a good way. Extending the benefits of the future to everybody. So, for example, I actually work with a couple of mentoring programs. So I'll call them out. So I work with the Mentor Project. So hello, Deborah, where we are trying to help change the lives of 1 billion children on the planet. So from my focus this year, outside of doing the things that I actually do, is to really try to push out and promote the positive change messages that I see, and actually start moving the dial, as I say, on some of these United Nations SDGs, but also trying to give people hope that the future that they are going into is a positive and decent and sort of more utopian future. As someone said to me a little while ago, a society without hope is simply marching into the darkness. But a society, basically, who believes that they're actually marching into the light, basically, where the future is positive, where it is more utopian than dystopian, they will have a much, much better mindset. They will be happier, and they will go the extra mile to actually help create these futures. So, in summary, I'm here to show people that they are marching into the light, not the dark.